Richard Benjamin Harrison built a pawn shop empire and became a television icon. But what he left behind after his death stunned everyone who thought they knew him. The old man, as millions knew him, seemed like an open book on Pawn Stars. He was a grumpy grandfather figure who delivered one-liners and kept his family in check. But his final wishes revealed a side of him that fans never saw on camera. The testament he left behind sparked family tensions, raised questions about his true intentions, and exposed secrets that had been carefully hidden throughout 17 seasons of television. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling changed everything. The will that nobody expected. What do you do when the person you thought you knew completely surprises you from beyond the grave? When Richard Harrison passed away in June of 2018 at the age of 77, the assumption was simple. He'd leave his fortune to his family, particularly his son Rick and grandson Corey, the faces of Pawn Stars alongside him. The shop would continue operating. The television show would go on, and the Harrison legacy would remain intact. That's what everyone expected, including some members of his own family. But the actual contents of his will told a different story. Richard had made specific, deliberate choices about who would receive what, and those choices didn't align with what people assumed based on watching the show. The testament revealed that the old man had been planning for this moment far longer than anyone realized, making adjustments and changes that reflected relationships viewers never fully understood. One of the most shocking elements was how he divided his assets. The gold and silver pawn shop, valued at several $1,000,000 and generating significant revenue from both its business operations and the television show, wasn't simply handed down in equal shares. Richard had opinions about who deserved what, and he made those opinions legally binding. Some family members were included in ways that surprised people. Others were notably excluded or given far less than expected. The timing of certain changes to his will also raised eyebrows. Richard had updated his testament multiple times in the years before his death, including modifications made after Pawn Stars became a massive success. These weren't minor tweaks. They were substantial changes that redistributed wealth and power within the family in ways that suggested conflict, favoritism, or both. For a man who seemed straightforward on television, his final legal documents revealed a complexity that fans never witnessed during his decades on screen. What made this particularly shocking was how it contrasted with the image presented on Pawn Stars. The show portrayed the Harrisons as a tight-knit family working together, disagreeing occasionally but always united by their shared business and family bonds. The old man was the patriarch who kept everyone in line, but his testament suggested that behind the scenes, relationships were more complicated, more strained, and more carefully negotiated than the editing ever showed. The legal document wasn't just about money, either. Richard included personal items, sentimental objects, and specific instructions about how certain possessions should be handled. A vintage Navy uniform went to one grandson. A collection of rare coins went to another family member. His favorite reading chair, the one he sat in during countless episodes, had a designated recipient. Each decision was intentional, and each revealed something about his relationships that the public had never seen. Perhaps most telling was what Richard chose to put in writing versus what he left unsaid. Certain family members were mentioned by name with specific bequests. Others were covered under general categories. And a few weren't mentioned at all, their absence from the document speaking louder than any words could have. For fans who thought they understood the Harrison family dynamics from watching television, the will was an education in how little they actually knew. Building an empire from nothing, how does a man go from Navy sailor to multimillionaire television star in the 70s? To understand why Richard Harrison's testament shocked so many people, you need to understand what he built and where he came from. Richard wasn't born into wealth or opportunity. He grew up during the Great Depression in Lexington, North Carolina, where money was scarce and survival required creativity and determination. His childhood shaped his entire approach to business, family, and money in ways that would echo through his testament decades later. He served in the Navy for 20 years, learning discipline, strategy, and how to assess situations quickly and accurately. Those military skills translated directly into his pawn shop career. Evaluating items, reading people, knowing when to negotiate and when to walk away. These weren't just business tactics. They were survival skills he'd honed over decades of military service. When he finally retired from the Navy, Richard had a pension but not wealth. He needed to build something that would support his family, and he needed to do it starting from almost nothing. The path to the gold and silver pawn shop wasn't direct. Richard worked various jobs, saved money, and studied the pawn business before taking the leap. He understood that Las Vegas, with its constant flow of tourists and gamblers, provided unique opportunities. People won big and wanted to celebrate with purchases. People lost big and needed quick cash. The cycle was predictable, and Richard positioned himself to benefit from both sides of it. The pawn shop opened in 1989 in Las Vegas, a city built on people losing money and sometimes needing quick cash to get back in the game. Richard understood his customers because he'd been broke himself. He knew what it felt like to need money desperately and to have something valuable you were willing to part with temporarily. That empathy, combined with sharp eye for what items were actually worth, made him successful in a business where many others failed. For years, the gold and silver pawn shop was just another business in Las Vegas. It did well enough to support the family, but it wasn't making anyone rich. Richard worked the counter, evaluated items, negotiated prices, and built a reputation for being fair even when he was driving a hard bargain. His son, Rick, worked alongside him, learning the business and developing his own expertise in historical items and collectibles. Together, they created something sustainable but not yet extraordinary. The business grew steadily through the 90s and 2000s. They expanded their inventory, hired reliable employees, and established themselves as one of the go-to pawn shops in Las Vegas. Richard's reputation for honest dealing attracted customers who could have gone anywhere but chose the gold and silver because they trusted the man behind the counter. That trust was valuable, and Richard understood its worth even if it didn't immediately translate to massive profits. Everything changed in 2009 when the History Channel approached them about a reality show. The network was looking for authentic businesses with interesting personalities, and the gold and silver pawn shop fit perfectly. Richard was skeptical at first. He was 68 years old and had no interest in being on television, but he understood opportunity when he saw it, and he agreed to participate without any real expectation of what would happen next. Pawn Stars premiered and became an immediate hit, averaging more than 3 million viewers per episode at its peak. Suddenly, the gold and silver pawn shop wasn't just a local business. It was a tourist destination. People flew to Las Vegas specifically to visit the shop, meet the family, and maybe get on television themselves. Revenue exploded, not just in the show, but from the increased foot traffic and merchandise sales. Richard's face appeared on T-shirts, hats, and promotional materials. The grumpy old man who just wanted to run his pawn shop became an international celebrity. By the time Richard died, estimates put his net worth at around $5 million. That doesn't include the overall value of the business or the ongoing revenue from the television show, which was generating approximately $100,000 per episode for the main cast members. For a man who started with nothing and didn't open his famous pawn shop until his 50s, that accumulation of wealth was remarkable. And it meant that how he chose to distribute that wealth would have significant consequences for everyone involved. The empire Richard built wasn't just financial. He created a brand, a television phenomenon, and a family business that employed dozens of people. His testament would need to address all of these elements, not just the bank accounts and property. How do you divide something as intangible as a television reputation? How do you ensure a business continues thriving when the person most identified with that business is gone? These were the questions Richard grappled with when crafting his final wishes. The family dynamics nobody talked about Pawn Stars showed viewers a sanitized version of the Harrison family. There was the old man, grumpy but lovable. There was Rick, the knowledgeable one who brought in experts and made big deals. There was Corey, Rick's son, learning the business and occasionally clashing with his father. And there was Chum Lee, the comedic relief who was actually a childhood friend of Corey's rather than a blood relative. On screen, they bickered and joked, but everything was resolved by the end of each episode. Reality was messier. Richard had been married to his wife Joanne for 58 years, and by all accounts, that relationship was solid. She was the one constant in his life, the person who'd been with him through Navy deployments, the struggle to establish the pawn shop, and the unexpected celebrity that came in their 70s. Joanne rarely appeared on the show, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But those who knew the couple understood that she was Richard's foundation, the person whose opinion mattered most when he made major decisions. But his relationships with his sons were more complicated. Richard had 3 sons: Rick, who worked at the pawn shop and became the face of the business; Sherry, who largely stayed out of the public eye; and Joseph, who also maintained a low profile. The show focused almost exclusively on Rick, creating the impression that he was Richard's primary heir and successor. This focus wasn't accidental. Rick was the one who committed to the pawn shop business, who'd worked alongside his father for decades, and who had the knowledge and personality to carry the business forward. Rick and Richard's relationship was complex in ways the show only occasionally hinted at. They worked together for decades, built a business together, and clearly had mutual respect. But they also butted heads constantly. Richard came from a generation that believed in tough love and harsh criticism as motivational tools. Rick grew up with that approach and sometimes resented it, even as he employed similar tactics with his own son Corey. The tension between them was real, and it influenced decisions Richard made about the business and his estate. The dynamic played out in small moments that fans noticed if they paid attention. Richard would dismiss Rick's ideas with a wave of his hand. Rick would make decisions without consulting his father and face the consequences. They negotiated with each other almost like adversaries sometimes, each trying to prove they were right about an item's value or a business decision. The show framed this as entertaining banter, but people close to the family recognized it as genuine conflict that had been present for years before the cameras ever arrived. Corey's position in the family business was also more precarious than the show suggested. While Pawn Stars portrayed him as a natural successor, learning from both his grandfather and father, his actual role in decision-making was limited. Richard and Rick made the important calls. Corey handled day-to-day operations and dealt with customers, but he didn't have the authority viewers might have assumed. That power dynamic created friction, especially as Corey got older and felt he deserved more control and respect. The generational divide was significant. Richard had built the business from nothing and felt ownership over every aspect of it. Rick had worked for decades to help grow the business and felt he'd earned the right to make executive decisions. Corey had grown up in the business and on television and felt his contributions were undervalued compared to his father and grandfather. 3 generations, 3 different perspectives on who deserved what and why. These tensions simmered throughout the show's run and would eventually influence how Richard structured his testament. Then there's the question of Richard's other children and grandchildren who weren't on the show. They existed. They were part of his life, but the television audience never saw them. Sherry and Joseph had their own relationships with Richard, their own expectations about inheritance, and their own feelings about being excluded from the public face of the family business. Did they resent Rick for being the chosen one? Did they understand why their father focused his attention and succession planning on the one son, who committed to the pawn shop? The answers to these questions would partially emerge when the will became public. Richard also had multiple grandchildren beyond Corey. Some worked at the pawn shop in minor roles. Others pursued completely different careers and had minimal involvement with the family business. Each of them had a relationship with their grandfather, and each probably had expectations about what might come their way after his death. Managing these relationships while maintaining fairness and also rewarding those who'd actually contributed to the business success was a delicate balance that Richard had to strike in his testament. The shocking exclusions and inclusions, what would you think if your father's will didn't mention you at all? When the details of Richard Harrison's will became public, the most shocking element wasn't who got the most money. It was who was excluded and who received unexpected inheritances. Richard left nothing to his son Rick, at least not directly through the will. This stunned fans who assumed Rick would inherit a significant portion of his father's estate, given that he worked alongside Richard for decades and was the most visible member of the family business besides the old man himself. The reason for Rick's exclusion was actually practical rather than punitive, but it still surprised people. Rick already owned a significant stake in the gold and silver pawn shop and was positioned to control the business after his father's death. Richards were reflected in understanding that Rick was already taken care of through business ownership and didn't need additional inheritance. The pawn shop itself, with its ongoing revenue from both normal operations and the television show, was worth more than any cash bequest could have been. But the optics of not leaving anything directly to your son in your will, especially when that son was your business partner and television co-star, struck many people as cold. It raised questions about their relationship and whether there had been conflicts that the public never knew about. Had Rick done something to disappoint his father? Was Richard punishing him for some perceived failure? The truth was more mundane, but the appearance fed speculation and gossip that the family had to address publicly. Instead, Richard left the bulk of his estate to his wife Joanne, which was expected and standard, but he also made specific bequests to other family members that revealed his priorities and values. He left money to grandchildren, including some who never appeared on Pawn Stars. These weren't token amounts either. Richard designated substantial sums that would help these grandchildren buy homes, start businesses, or secure their financial futures. The amounts varied based on need, relationship, and Richard's assessment of who would use the money wisely versus who might squander it. He made provisions for family members who'd stayed out of the spotlight, recognizing that just because they weren't on television didn't mean they weren't important to him. One relative received enough money to pay off their mortgage. Another got funds specifically designated for their children's education. Richard wasn't just distributing wealth randomly. He was solving problems and meeting needs that he'd been aware of but couldn't or wouldn't address while he was alive. One particularly interesting inclusion was a provision he made for certain employees of the gold and silver pawn shop. Richard left specific amounts to people who'd worked for him for years, recognizing their loyalty and contribution to his success. This was unusual for someone in his position, as most business owners don't include employees in their personal wills, but it reflected Richard's values. He believed in rewarding people who showed up, worked hard, and stayed loyal, even if they weren't family. The employees who received bequests weren't necessarily the ones with the most seniority or the highest positions. They were the ones Richard personally valued, the ones who demonstrated the qualities he admired most. One employee who received money had started as a teenager and worked at the shop for over 15 years, never missing a shift and never causing drama. Another had helped Richard with a personal project that had nothing to do with the business. Each bequest told a story about a relationship that viewers never saw, but that mattered deeply to Richard. The will also included specific instructions about how the business should be run after his death. Richard didn't just distribute assets and walk away. He created guidelines and expectations for how the pawn shop should operate, what values should guide business decisions, and how family conflicts should be resolved. These provisions suggested he was worried about what would happen when he was no longer there to maintain order and make final decisions. He'd seen families torn apart by inheritance disputes and business disagreements, and he was determined that wouldn't happen to the Harrisons. Some of the business instructions were surprisingly specific. Richard designated how certain types of items should be evaluated and sold. He outlined his expectations for customer service and employee treatment. He even included guidance on how to handle the television show and media opportunities, recognizing that Pawn Stars had become a major revenue source that needed to be managed carefully. These weren't just suggestions. They were binding instructions that his heirs were expected to follow. The testament also revealed Richard's concerns about specific family members and their ability to handle money responsibly. Some bequests came with conditions and restrictions. Money designated for one grandchild was placed in a trust that would distribute funds over time rather than all at once, suggesting Richard worried about that person's financial judgment. Another bequest included a requirement that the recipient complete college before receiving the full amount, reflecting Richard's belief in education despite his own limited formal schooling. The battle for control and the future of the business. Can a business survive when the person everyone associates with it is gone? Richard Harrison's death created a power vacuum at the gold and silver pawn shop, and his testament laid out a structure for filling that vacuum. But legal documents can only do so much. The real test was whether Rick could step into his father's role as the ultimate authority, whether Corey would accept his position in the hierarchy, and whether the business could survive without the old man's presence both behind the counter and on television. Rick became the primary owner and decision-maker, which was Richard's clear intention. But stepping into his father's shoes proved challenging in ways Rick hadn't fully anticipated. Richard had a natural authority that came from age, experience, and a personality that didn't tolerate nonsense. Customers, employees, and even family members deferred to him automatically. When the old man made a decision, it was final. When he said no to a deal, nobody argued. Rick had to earn that same respect, and doing so while also maintaining the television show and managing the increasingly complicated business proved exhausting. Corey's role became particularly complicated after Richard's death. He'd spent years learning the business and appearing on the show, assuming he was working toward a future where he'd eventually run things. But Richard's will and the business structure didn't guarantee Corey that future. Rick maintained control, and Corey had to navigate the difficult position of being visible enough to matter to the show, but not powerful enough to make major business decisions without his father's approval. The tension between Rick and Corey that had always simmered occasionally boiled over. In 2020, Corey was notably absent from the pawn shop for an extended period, and rumors circulated about family conflicts and power struggles. While both Rick and Corey downplayed the situation publicly, people close to the family confirmed that Richard's death had exacerbated existing tensions. Without the old man to mediate and provide perspective, father and son had to figure out how to work together without that buffer. Part of the conflict stemmed from generational differences in business philosophy. Rick, trained by Richard, believed in cautious expansion and protecting the core business. Corey, who'd grown up with social media and modern marketing, wanted to leverage their fame more aggressively. Financially, the business remained strong despite the challenges. The gold and silver pawn shop continued attracting tourists who wanted to visit the famous location from television. People still brought in interesting items hoping to make deals or get on camera. Revenue from the television show, while not at its peak, still provided substantial income, and Richard's careful financial planning meant the family had resources to weather any temporary difficulties. But Richard's testament had made clear that this success came with responsibilities. The money was meant to support the family for generations, not to be squandered by one generation. That pressure to maintain and grow what Richard built weighed heavily on Rick as he navigated his new role. What the testament revealed about the old man, what does it say about a man when his final wishes surprise everyone who thought they knew him? Beyond the specific bequests and business structures, Richard Harrison's testament revealed something deeper about who he was and what he valued. This wasn't just a legal document distributing assets. It was a final statement from a man who'd lived through the Great Depression, served his country, built a successful business, and become an unlikely television star in his 70s. The choices he made in that testament reflected a lifetime of experiences and values that the television show only partially captured. First, the testament showed that Richard valued loyalty and hard work above almost everything else. The employees he included weren't the most talented or the most educated. They were the ones who showed up consistently, did their jobs without drama, and remained committed to the shop even when they could have pursued other opportunities. Richard rewarded that loyalty because he understood its value. In a world where people constantly chase the next best thing, he appreciated those who stayed committed through good times and bad. This value system came directly from Richard's upbringing and military service. During the Depression, loyalty meant survival. Families and communities that stuck together made it through. Those who prioritized individual gain often ended up worse off. In the Navy, loyalty to your unit and your mission could mean the difference between life and death. Richard carried these lessons into civilian life, and they shaped how he ran his business and evaluated the people around him. Second, Richard's testament revealed his complicated relationship with fame and money. He'd become wealthy and famous in his 70s, long after most people retire. He enjoyed the recognition and the financial security, but he never seemed entirely comfortable with celebrity. His will reflected a desire to ensure that his wealth would support his family practically rather than enabling them to live off of success without working. There were no provisions for anyone to simply coast on inheritance. The money came with expectations and structures meant to encourage continued productivity. Richard had seen too many lottery winners and inheritance recipients squander their money through poor decisions and lack of discipline. He was determined that wouldn't happen to his family. The trust's conditions and restrictions in his will weren't about control from beyond the grave. They were about protecting his loved ones from their own potential weaknesses and ensuring the money would actually improve their lives rather than destroying them. Third, the testament exposed Richard's awareness of his family's weaknesses and conflicts. He didn't pretend everything was perfect or assume everyone would get along after his death. He built in safeguards, created structures for dispute resolution, and made his intentions clear enough that there would be minimal room for interpretation or argument. This wasn't cynicism. It was realism from a man who knew his family well and wanted to protect them from their own worst impulses. The dispute resolution mechanisms were particularly thoughtful. Richard designated a neutral third party to mediate any conflicts over the will's interpretation. He outlined a process for family members to raise concerns without litigation. He even included financial penalties for anyone who tried to contest the will frivolously, recognizing that some people might try to leverage legal threats to extract more money. These provisions showed a man who understood human nature and planned accordingly. Fourth, Richard's choices revealed his understanding that the business and the show were temporary. Nothing lasts forever, and he knew the gold and silver pawn shop would remain a tourist destination indefinitely. His testament directed money into investments and structures that would survive even if the pawn shop eventually closed or the television show was canceled. He was planning for a future he wouldn't see, trying to ensure his grandchildren and great-grandchildren would benefit from his success even decades after his death. The investment strategy outlined in his will was conservative and focused on long-term growth rather than quick returns. Real estate, stable stocks, bonds, and other traditional investments that would appreciate steadily over time. Richard didn't trust trendy investment schemes or high-risk opportunities. He'd built his wealth slowly through hard work and smart decisions, and he wanted his legacy preserved the same way. Fifth, the testament showed Richard's deep love for his wife Joanne and his desire to ensure she would be comfortable for the rest of her life. The bulk of his estate went to her, guaranteeing she'd never have financial worries regardless of what happened with the business or the show. But he also made provisions that gave her flexibility and control, recognizing that she might want to help children, grandchildren, or causes that mattered to her. His love wasn't controlling or restrictive. It was protective and empowering. Perhaps most importantly, Richard's testament revealed his understanding that legacy isn't just about money. It's about values, lessons, and the example you set for future generations. The money he left behind will eventually be spent or invested or passed along again. But the principles he embodied, hard work, loyalty, fairness, practicality, and strategic thinking, those lessons will influence his family for generations. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren will grow up hearing stories about the old man, and those stories will shape their own approaches to business, family, and life. What are your thoughts about the old man's testaments? Share with us in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories.